And so it's so important. Having a vision for life gives us diligence. What is written in the book X, Multiply Your God-Given Potential? I can't emphasize enough the importance of reading this book. There is so much more, so many keys in this book that I will not be able to cover even in 12 lessons. So the title of this lesson is Diligence. We're going to discover the importance of diligence in multiplication. Now, in the last lesson, if you'll recall, I talked about the importance of multiplying what belongs to someone else. If you're faithful in that which is another man's, if you're not faithful in that which is another man's, who will give you what is your own? In this lesson, I want to highlight the importance of diligence. Now, as a young boy, even not saved, I recognized how important diligence was in looking and observing the lives of my two grandfathers. I had one grandfather that when he retired at the age of 65, and I remember he would come and visit us for 2 weeks every year, and I would watch him. He would sit underneath our big maple tree in the backyard in a lounge chair, and he would smoke his pipe and just sit there and look all day. The one thing we did every day is we would go down to a grocery store that was a walking distance from our house, and he would get us a bag of candy, which we loved, but that's all he would do. He never helped in the kitchen. He would never help my mom and all the busyness that she was doing, wouldn't play games with us kids. He just sat under the tree. Then I had my other grandfather. He retired at the age of 62. And you know what he did when he retired? He started basically his second life. He went to Rutgers University. Yes, in his 60s. He's sitting in classroom. They didn't have online courses back then. He's sitting in a classroom with a bunch of 20-year-olds studying agriculture because he wanted to start a farm, a garden, a large garden, and he wanted to take care of animals. So he did that, and he did that very successfully. And then he wrote 2 books after that. And then he helped bring condominiums into the beaches of Florida. He was one of a group of men that actually brought condominiums so older people would have a beautiful place that they could be, because back in those days, they didn't have those high-rise condominiums. And I mean, he would come visit us. He would play lawn darts with me. We'd go play putt-putt. We would, go to the pool and have fun. He would help my mom cook meals. When we went to his house in New Jersey, he would take us to New York City, take us to Broadway. He'd take us deep sea fishing. He'd take us to help count money at a neighborhood's business. We count the money out of the dryers and the washing machines because the guy had, a laundromat. I mean, we were always active with him, and we were always laughing and having fun. Do you know, one grandfather died at 75 years of age, and the other one lived to 91. I bet you know which one lived to the age of 91. The one who was diligent, the one who had a vision for life. And so it's so important. Having a vision for life gives us diligence. And so multiplication, let me just say this, will not manifest out of a slothful, hesitant, careless, or apathetic motivation. I believe one of the greatest temptations in life, bar none, is the temptation to coast. We hit a level of success and we all of a sudden now start saying, I'm going to maintain instead of continue to multiply. So I want to read to you out of Romans chapter 12, verse 11. Paul writes this. Remember, this is a command. This is not a suggestion or a recommendation. Listen to his words. Never be lazy. Okay? Did you hear that? Never be lazy. If you have a tendency to go to lazy mode, you better check yourself. Now, does that mean we never rest? No, never, never, never. God says you are to take Sabbaths or Shabbats, whatever you want to call it. You are to rest on that 7th day. I'm not saying you have to physically do 7th. In the New Testament, I see that it's more of a making sure you get a right rhythm of life where when you're resting for the purpose of producing more, but when you're working, you're diligent. Okay, I hope that's clear. Never be lazy, but work hard. Remember, this is a command. This is the Apostle Paul. Work hard and serve the Lord enthusiastically. First of all, Paul says, work hard. This is one of the first traits you must exhibit to multiply. Second, he says, do it enthusiastically. Now, I love that word enthusiastically. It's actually, its origins, it's a Latin word, and do you know what it means? God within. When you see somebody who's got an enthusiastic attitude, often it is motivated by their vision from life, and it's God working within them. So hard work, and I want to make this statement, I want you to write this down. Hard work is the evidence of true faith. Okay, write that down. Hard work is the evidence of true faith. Your belief is what energizes you. You know, a lot of people, I'm 61 years old, and people say, man, you just don't seem 60. I would guess you in your late 40s, and you have the energy of a 40-year-old. I'd say, yeah, because I got a vision. I got a vision. I'm engaged. I'm multiplying with the gifts that God's placed in my life, and I'm just going. I'm going to be more like my grandfather who lived till he was 91. An important exception is this. Not all hard work is an outward sign of faith. Sometimes the motivation is fear, but you'll never find somebody who has faith who's lazy. So you will always find diligence in a person who has faith. In getting back to our story, I remember, the diligence that I exemplified in building those first 2 churches that I was a part of. And then our pastor launched us on the road. And I'm going to be really honest with you, Lisa and I, when we were birthing Messenger International in 1990, there were times that we were working until 11 o'clock at night. Yeah, I remember we had a little tiny 3-bedroom house. I think it was about 1,500 square feet. And we put our 2 sons in one room, and we made the 3rd bedroom our office. And I was duplicating tapes sometimes at 11 o'clock at night. Duplicating tapes, yeah. We'd have a master, and then you'd have slaves. They called the slaves. And we'd put the cassette tapes in there, and it would reproduce from the master to the slaves. Then I would type it on a typewriter, because we didn't have a computer in 1990, and then we'd put the label on there. I was the secretary, I was the mailman, Lisa was doing all the same things. We were, doing our newsletter that went out to about 150 people. We were collating them physically, according to zip code, putting stamps on them. I mean, we're doing everything. We're busy, we're diligent, because we knew we were called to preach what God had put within us to people, and we wanted to be diligent about it. And so Lisa and I never thought twice about working until 10, 11 o'clock at night, and we were up early in the morning. I was out at about 5:30 in the morning, and I'm praying, and I'm commanding doors to open up in the north, the south, the east, and the west, because God told me, He said, son, don't send letters to pastors, don't make phone calls to pastors and tell them you can come preach. I want you to pray, and I want you to believe me that I'll open the door. And I'm telling you, it was amazing. There were times we'd go 3 weeks and I wouldn't have a place to preach, but I just keep doing the same thing, making more tapes, praying in the morning, writing more letters and thank you notes, and writing articles for our newsletter, and that was a real job for me, because that gift of writing hadn't come on me yet. But anyway, we're exemplifying what it means to be diligent. But then the word came in the summer of 1991. God spoke to me and said, son, I want you to write. And I remember doing nothing, as I told you in an earlier lesson. 10 months later, those 2 women came to me from 2 different states. They said, John, if you don't write what God's giving you to write, He'll give the message to somebody else, and one day you're going to have to give an account of it. I remember writing that contract with God. And then I sat down and I started writing. But here's what was troubling me. I thought, Lord, I'm already working like 50, 60 hours a week. How can I write a book? The ministry's going to suffer. And I remember Lisa and I talked to each other, and she said, I'll make up time. I'll do this, I'll do that, so that you can give time to writing. And I remember both of us now are working till late at night. I'm writing this book, and it took me a whole year to write this book. And I remember the first editor we sent it to, he said it was horrible. And he said, who do you think you are to make statements like this that you made in your book? Because I was calling for people to repent and this and that. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so we sent it to another editor, and he edited it and did a horrible job. So we sent it to another editor, and she said, hey, you can't fix a botch. I recommend you just throw everything those 2 editors did away. I know you paid money for both of them. Throw it away and start from your original manuscript. And she said, Lisa, you should edit your husband's book and then send it to me. Well, this woman did a fabulous job, and I sent my manuscript to 2 publishers, 2 nationally known publishers, one in Orlando, one in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The one in Tulsa I'd never heard from. The one in Orlando wrote back and said, your manuscript is too preachy. We don't want it. We only do big names, people that are known and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I said, God, what do I do? I said, you told me to write. So I said, Lisa, let's just print it ourselves. Let's self-publish it. So we printed 5,000 copies. And I remember putting boxes in our little Honda Civic. We're going to the churches. I'm preaching my heart out on this message. And I'm telling you, the books would just fly off the table. I mean, if there was 80 people in the church, it was like 40 books sold because the message really had substance to it. And we just kept doing this. And so then I felt to write another book. And I wrote the second book. I sent it to publishers, no response. I sent it to my second-year Bible school teacher because she was my favorite teacher and she had written and published some books and she wrote me back and said, who do you think you are? This is terrible. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I was fighting discouragement like you can't believe. And I remember at one point in time, I laid on our living room floor and just stared at a spot in the ceiling for like 30 minutes. Thinking, what have you done? You've spent 2 years writing and nobody is interested except for the few people you preach to. Did discouragement try to hit me? Yes, you better believe it. But I was convinced that God had called me to write books that would go all over the world. I knew it. I knew it. And yet I'm getting all these discouraging reports and I have the opportunity. Am I going to listen to my second-year Bible school teacher who I so admired? Am I going to listen to these publishers who aren't answering or who's saying my writing is too preachy? Am I going to listen to my friends who were criticizing my writings? Yes, I had a friend who said, John, I think you used too many scriptures in your book. And I mean, I was so discouraged. I should say this. I was fighting discouragement. I would have to stir myself up, rouse myself up, because guess what? It was time to write a third book. God had dropped another message in me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to write another book, and nobody is even interested in taking books. And I remember a friend of mine called me, and he said, hey, John, I want to take you to lunch with a friend of mine. So this is a friend of mine who has another friend that I've never met, and he wants to take me to lunch with him. So we meet up at this restaurant, and it turns out this friend is the publisher of one of the publishing houses, the one in Florida, that rejected my first 2 books. So we're at lunch, and he's a new guy. The other guy that was the head of the publishing house had left, and this is the new guy. And the new guy's just looking at me, asking about my family, asking about what we do. And he said, so you travel and preach. What are you preaching right now? And I started sharing with him about offenses, how offenses take people into captivity. And you would know it as the message, the bait of Satan. So I'm sharing this message. And at the restaurant, the guy looks at me and goes, oh, we could never publish this. I said, what? We could never publish this because we only do 24 books a year and we do well-known pastors and authors. I said, you asked what I was preaching. You didn't, I'm not trying to convince you to publish. He said, oh yeah, that's right, I'm sorry. So I keep telling them about the message. 15 minutes later, he goes, can you get a manuscript to me? I said, for what? He said, I want to publish this. I said, I thought you just said you could never publish this. He said, as I listen to you, this message has to get into the earth. So I wrote that book. They published it. It didn't do very well. It didn't sell well at all. Maybe a few thousand copies. But I was so discouraged because I knew in my heart God had called me to write books that would go to millions of people. It came out June of 1994. Well, later that year, I got a call from the publisher. They said, hey, an international talk show wants to have you on. They want to talk about your wife and yours ministry, how you're doing it with your children, and they want to mention the book, The Bait of Satan. I said, great, great. So I remember coming on that program, January 16th, 1995. And we were only supposed to do 20 minutes, just mention the book. The couple that was interviewing me held up The Bait of Satan and said, tell me about this book. And for the next 40 minutes, I shared on that message. Well, every bookstore in America was sold out the next day. And the publisher was 20,000 back ordered by 2 days later. That book exploded and it became a national bestseller. But was that the extent of the multiplication that God was going to do with books? Well, if you stay with me, you're going to find out that the multiplication is only just beginning. And I'm going to tell you something very interesting in this story. The publisher that published that book was the one that rejected me, and since that time it has become one of its top-selling books of all time. Isn't it just like God? He sees you rejected, but He's actually laughing and going, oh yeah, this is the publisher I'm going to use to get this message out to the world. Listen, let me tell you something. I wanted to stop in my diligence so many times. I wanted to quit. I wanted to throw in the towel, but I knew God had spoken to me. That's why faith is so important. That's why a biblical vision is so important. What I mean by biblical vision is spending time with God to get the vision of what you're supposed to do and then believing it no matter what